This is a grass field not too far away from where I live. Unfortunately, with many open spaces, like this one with a highway that divides it, the land is oftentimes broken up by obstacles. If you ever find yourself wandering a field like this one, especially in the autumn, you'll find that the life here is subtle, yet interesting. At times, sheltered and vibrant, and simple. Here's a perfect example: a ballooning spider off to uncharted territories. Now, the grass that grows in this field is definitely not native. In fact, it's probably an invasive species, but nonetheless, it still provides a fantastic ecosystem to the life here in the field. Near the end of every year, this type of grass produces seeds, dies off, and turns golden. I've always wanted to make paper and art out of this grass. So today I'm going to start the 6-day process in doing just that. So I spent the day looking for a place where I could take an inconspicuous amount of grass. Using a pair of gardening shears, I began cutting bundles of grass to later take home. Even though all of this grass will be gone in a few months, I always make sure I cut from multiple spots because honestly, I'd hate to just leave an eyesore in the middle of a field. I also find that folding up the bundles of grass in my palm make it a lot easier for storing them in this canvas bag. Once I feel like I have enough grass for paper making, I pack up and head on home. And now I can officially start day one of this whole process. I'm back at home and ready to process all of this raw organic grass. And the first step is, again with my garden shears, cutting all the grass into tiny 1-inch pieces. For this part of the process, I decided to put a glove on, mostly because I don't want to cut myself. But looking back, I probably should have worn a glove when I was out in the field, because you never know what you're going to end up grabbing out there. To catch all these tiny little pieces, I'm using one of those giant hardware store buckets. Although I did end up having to do quite a bit of sweeping at the end because this part's pretty messy. So here are all of my grass clippings. Kind of looks like a whole bunch of hay or even that like hamster bedding, but it's going to turn into paper. And actually it's pretty dusty and dirty, and so I don't want that in my paper or in my lungs. So I'm giving it just a quick wash. So now that my bucket is all full of water, I want to agitate the grass and really get all that dirt off. This is just one of my paper making utensils, but to be honest, a wooden pole like this works way better for mixing this amount of grass. To get the grass out of all of this dirty water, you don't really need a strainer because I can just pick it up and squeeze it like a giant sponge and get all that water out and move it over to a separate bowl. And I just repeat that over and over again until I get the majority of this bulky grass out. I really don't want any of the grass to go to waste, so anything that is remaining, I use my small strainer here to get all that out. Because this grass is so dry and stiff, I really want to soften it up as much as I can. So with some washing soda, which I'll mention later, and some more water, I'm going to mix it all up and let it sit overnight for a cold soak. And this should hopefully help me out in the long run. And plus, I'm starting to run out of daylight. It's now day 2 of the paper making process. And this is our grass after it's been cold soaking overnight. It's definitely more spongy. It's a little bit softer, but with some heat, we can make that even more soft. I get my stove ready to boil some water, and then I begin measuring out that washing soda I had mentioned earlier. For me, I use about 10 grams for every liter of water. It works great at breaking down those hardy plant fibers, and it's pretty easy to make. All you have to do is take an even layer of baking soda and bake it in your oven at 350 until all the water is evaporated and you have an even finer powder than the baking soda itself. It's also pretty easy to find in a store or online. Once I have the grass in the boiling water, I let it boil for 2 whole hours. Once it's done, it should look a little something like this. And using this trusty pasta server, I scoop out all the grass into a second bowl. And any little bits of grass left behind, I strain out, but do not use a plastic bowl like I'm doing here. This bowl did not survive because the water is just too hot, which is kind of a bummer because I thought maybe I could use the water to make ink or even tone some paper. Now, before I can blend the grass, I literally have to beat it into a pulp. For me, I found that having a large concrete paver like this one as the surface works really well. I also use a old paint scraper so I don't have to use my hands to push the grass around. And then I use this wooden pole here, which I've been using for a lot of the paper making process. It's actually just an extra redwood pole that I rounded the corners of, and it actually works really well. But I've used an old wooden baseball bat before too. This part of the paper making process can surprisingly take quite a long time. So for me, I usually spend anywhere from 45 to 60 minutes working on an individual pile of grass pulp. This is definitely one of those steps where having music in my headphones really helps get the job done. Let's time lapse through the rest of this so we can see what it looks like. By the end of this step, I always find it a little bit funny because it tends to look like a cow patty, but I guess that makes sense because cows eat lots of grass. But you can see my paint scrapers come in handy. And another helpful technique is this rolling pin method. It works a little bit better towards the end of this step when everything is starting to get all mushy, but it helps get everything even more mushy, which is exactly what you want. So here's the grass after all of that work, and I think it's safe to say this is a pulp now, although it's not quite at the last step. We do have to blend it and make it even finer, but I'm running out of time for today, so I'm going to stick this in a Ziploc bag, and I'm actually going to put it in the fridge. It is organic material, so I don't want it to get stinky or grow bacteria or anything. So we're going to keep it in there overnight and then come back tomorrow and start the blending. So now it's day 3 of this process. I have my pulp, which I've just grabbed out of the fridge. And hey, you know what? It smells actually fresh, which is funny. But it's ready to be blended. And then I kind of eyeball some basic measurements a 1-to-2 ratio, 1 part grass. I use this small dish, and then 2 parts water. And then I adjust some settings on the blender. Usually start off with a low setting, but eventually go to the highest setting, and I blend the grass. And now that I have the grass looking really pulpy, I'm going to dump it into the bucket. Sometimes the mixture can be a little too thick for my blender. I'll just give it a quick mix, add in some extra water, and do it again. Now that my pulp is all done, I need to prepare one more ingredient. And that's okra. For me, I just pick it up in the frozen vegetable aisle in the store. I put it into the same pot I was using before, and I'm going to cook it down and boil it in some water. What I'm going to get from it is this gooey, slimy liquid. I know it sounds kind of gross, but it works fantastic as a formation aid while we're making paper. I strain out the okra into a glass bowl this time, and you'll see when I lift up the strainer just how viscous this liquid is. I even use an old t-shirt to twist out as much of that gooey stuff that I can from the okra. And now I think I'm just about ready to add everything into my vat. So in goes the pulp, and in goes the okra. And then I give the whole thing a really good mix. Now it's finally time to pull my first sheet of paper. Using this deckle and mold that I made, and I actually have a whole video on how I made that, but I'm using it to drag through this pulp and water mixture and picking up a layer of the pulp. I swoosh the water back and forth, trying my best to make an even layer. I find that the grass fiber is really good at naturally just making itself an even layer, and plus the okra helps a lot. So I move it over to the corner of my tub here. It's actually just a plastic sterilite tub. But I let it drain for a second, and then I carefully take the mold off. So now I flip it onto my couching station. And this is the station where I press it into a cloth material. Here I'm using a brand new dry paint roller, but I also use a sponge. I give it a few gentle tugs to see if it's going to pop off the screen, and if it's not, I go back with the sponge. Once it seems like it's off the screen, I lift the screen and reveal my paper that's ready to dry. You can see the texture of the screen on this side, but on the opposite side, where I'm using an old t-shirt, it should be nice and smooth. Now I'm bringing it over to a blanket to dry. This is just my method because today I'm planning on making about 15 sheets of paper. So I need a lot of space to let these dry. And by the end of the day, this is what my garage looked like, full of paper. But I was losing daylight, so I'm going to have to come back next time and finish the rest. Now it's day 4 of this paper making project, and this is what my couching station looks like. I have some rubber sheets on a masonite board because it can get wet and I want to protect it from water. I have a towel to absorb even more water, which I clip on with some binder clips. And here's a quick update on this deckle and mold I made. It's starting to sag a little bit with that cheaper screen, so I had to do some extra stapling. But hey, 15 sheets of paper is not too bad for this cheap screen. And this is the vat that I was left with last time. It's actually been 2 days because I had work. But look at all those bubbles. And to be honest, it smells like it's a little bit fermented. So this is going to be a little bit of an experiment to see how fermented pulp will affect paper. Will it or will it not? So just like last time, I give my vat a nice mix. And then I'll use my deckle and mold and pull another sheet of paper. I make sure I take my time and let the pulp sink to the bottom of the screen. As the pulp starts to sink, I tilt my deckle and mold forward and backwards and side to side and let the excess water drain off. And then I'll sit here for a minute and let the water drip into the vat. Once the pulp is secure enough, I can give the screen a little tilt and let the water drain out of the corner. And then I prop it up on the corner of my tub, and I like to let it rest for about a minute or two. While it's resting, I'll give my old t-shirt a flattening. Carefully pull the mold off the deckle. And then flip the paper onto the t-shirt. Again, I'm starting with my dry paint roller. I find that the paint roller helps me press everything evenly into the t-shirt in one go. But I definitely like using a sponge to get into the sides and the corners and really just figure out if there's any areas that need extra attention. But I found that my favorite tool for the job is this microfiber cloth. It does a really great job at absorbing any of that extra water, which is what I want. And I can just turn it over or flip it around and have another dry side that I can press the paper with. And once the paper feels like it's securely on the paper, I'll give the screen a careful lift. Here you can see it actually pop off the screen a bit at the end. And for this batch of paper, I decided instead of laying it out on a blanket, I'm going to stack these one on top of another. I've done both methods before, and I'm just kind of curious to see with this paper specifically if one way or the other will make it a little more wrinkly or a little more flat. I'm really trying my best to line up each individual page because I don't want any weird indents or anything like that to happen. And then I'll put a plain t-shirt on top, a flat piece of board, and then I'm going to weigh these down with some more stepping stones. This is probably about 100 pounds worth of weight. And just so you know, this whole process doesn't always go so smoothly.
First rip.
So when this happens, this tells me I either didn't press it enough, my screen is getting too loose, or in this case, the pulp is getting too thin compared to the water in my vat. So now this is day 5, and my paper is starting to look dry and almost done. I give them a quick touch test, and if they're starting to feel crispy and the corners are popping off the t-shirt or whatever fabric I'm using, I know that they're ready. So with this batch, I'm really happy I chose old t-shirts because they peeled off super easy. I just made sure I had enough pressure where I was pulling the t-shirt off of the paper and I didn't have any rips. And to be honest, this is probably one of the most satisfying parts about making your own paper. Now, these sheets are a little too wrinkly and warped for my taste, but I've ironed grass paper before, so I wanted to give it a try on this specific batch. As I rotate the paper, I try my best to get rid of the wrinkles by evenly applying heat and pressing them out to the edge. So this is a fast solution that works somewhat, and I've had success in the past. But with this paper, it left it still a little too warped. So my solution now is to just give it time. And what I mean by that is time under pressure. So again, I'm using a flat board and stacking up about 100 pounds worth of stepping stones. I'm going to let this paper sit under here for about 2 whole days. It's now day 6, and I get to reveal to you the end result. And this is it. 100% wild autumn grass paper. So one side, like I said before, is texturized from the screen, and the opposite side is nice and smooth from the t-shirt. I absolutely love the way that the grass seeds are dispersed throughout the whole paper, and it really catches the light in such an odd way. Looking up close, you can really see the unique texture and the different fibers and the way the seeds are dispersed. Of course, like any other homemade paper, it has that awesome deckled edge. And I think the color of the paper does an amazing job at reflecting the source it came from. What about that paper that came from the fermented pulp? Well, that's what this one looks like. Not all of them are this wrinkled, but you'll see later that it is slightly darker than the rest. Altogether, I was able to make 15 pages of paper. And to be honest, I was a little tempted to make an awesome looking book out of these. But I'm excited to explore these in all sorts of ways, and maybe now you can too. One of the main reasons I started this whole project was because I have the opportunity to show a piece in an art show, and I just thought to myself, it has to be some wild grass paper. I also really wanted to figure out how I can make a giant piece of paper, and because space is limited where I am, I came up with this grid system instead. The other idea I almost went with was printing photography on this paper again. I still will do that again in the future, but time was running a little too low for this project, and I decided to come up with something different. Something simple, something minimalist. That's my style anyways. I started to find myself inspired by artists like Mark Rothko, who's known for these striking yet simple color field paintings. I couldn't help but think about how Rothko's field and my field were related in a way. Another artist influence was Richard Long, specifically his work walking through nature. I couldn't help but also feel like I was walking through the field while making this piece. After I made all of this paper, I also made this panel and the frame that goes around it so I could mount the paper to it. I decided on a design that was simple and minimalist, but emphasized line. It's hard to tell from this angle because the paper catches the light in such a way, but there are some really nice color shifts among the different pieces of paper, specifically that one that came from the fermented pulp. To mount these pages onto my panel, I have to carefully measure and line up where each page is going to go, and I have to do each one individually. I find out where it's going to go and make sure it's overlapping just enough, and then I mark with a pencil where my glue is going to stay. Using some acid-free, this is actually bookbinding glue, I apply some beads of glue to the panel. I apply it evenly, but it doesn't have to be perfect because the paper doesn't have to be exactly flat. In fact, I'd love for it to show as much texture as possible. Then I bring my paper over and carefully line it up to where it's supposed to go. I use my hands to initially press it down, but using some spare 1x2s, I'm going to use them to weigh down the edges and the middle. I have to do this process for every single page, and by the end, I just have a couple touch-ups I have to weigh down. Once it's dry, it'll be ready for the art gallery. And here is part of a group show in my local gallery, and actually paired with one of my sculptures. I decided to call this paper piece Once an Expanse. In this lighting, you can really tell which paper is a different color, and I used that paper to make the focal point line down the middle. For the presentation of this piece, I just framed it with some simple pine from the hardware store and signed the corner in a white colored pencil. For me, the way the grid breaks up this paper symbolizes the way the different parcels of land, especially among open spaces, are divided up. The central line, which is purposely skewed smaller at the top and larger at the bottom, is supposed to symbolize either a trail going through the grass field or a border that divides the field in half. Ultimately, it's a meditation on where the grass came from, our open spaces, and the things that divide them.